Greetings and welcome. We are now ready for our first comments on Plato's Republic. My assumption is that you have looked at our lecture notes in advance. My assumption is that you have a copy of Plato's Republic in front of you. We will be in Plato Republic 1 right away. I'm going to do two things today. One, I want to make some general observations about Republic, just kind of Platonism and general ideas. Then we will, go specifically to our work of Republic itself, all right? Let's talk for a few moments in general about the Republic. The Republic is the high watermark of Platonism, okay? It is the single dialogue of all dialogues that Plato worked with. Everything kind of points towards Republic, and it is the culmination in many ways then of his most crucial ideas. Two, this dialogue becomes the central building stone of Western philosophic discourse. The easiest way to explain that is to say, all of the major disciplines that we study at university today are going to be introduced in this dialogue, in this one dialogue. And to that degree, it makes it that important a dialogue. So we will find ourselves coming back to this text over and over again. Now again, just to remind, we will make no distinctions between Platonist thought and Socratic thought. Okay? In our time together, because we're obviously undergraduates, we will make no distinctions between those two. All right? So in other words, whatever Plato has to say on a topic, we'll say Socrates has to say on the topic. Okay? So let's get to it. What do these dialogues look like, and how do we know how to read them? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked. First of all, let's say that these dialogues are intentionally dramatic in their construction. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you're supposed to kind of think about a little play of sorts. There's a dramatic quality to all of the dialogues. So you have this conversation that's going to go on, and that means in the early part of the dialogue, anytime you pick up one of these dialogues to read it, in the early part of the dialogue is kind of like what we call a framing sequence. In other words, you kind of set up the conversation. Who's there? Where are we? What's going to be the primary topic of the conversation? Earlier I said to you that Socrates is imagined as sitting at the fountain at the mall, and it's true that sometimes the agora is going to be the place where these conversations take place. One of the most famous happens in a dialogue called the Gorgas, where they're in the mall having this conversation, and we're told that Socrates is talking, and all of a sudden he looks up and he sees Callicles coming. Callicles is kind of like the wealthy man of the day, if you will. All right, the owner of Microsoft, of course, is known to have some currency. It would be somebody like that. So he looks up and he sees Callicles coming, and Socrates says, hey, let's ask Callicles what he thinks about this. And Plato says, look, you know Callicles hates your guts. It will later be Callicles and Miletus and others that will bring him to trial, etc., etc. And Socrates says, no, I want to hear what he has to say. Callicles will walk by the fountain at the mall, and we're told that the old man Socrates reaches out and grabs Callicles on the arm, arresting his walk. And Callicles immediately tries to pull away, and the old man Socrates, a little more firm on his arm, says, we have a conversation, we're engaged in a conversation, we need your help. Callicles is like, get away from me, what is wrong with you? You know, this kind of thing. You're a troublemaker. Remember, that's the reason he's brought to trial. And Socrates, we're told, calms his voice and says to him, we're engaged in a conversation of great importance. Our question is, what course of life is best? What course of life is best? Now there are some, Dennis Dalton one of them, who lectures as a Platonist, who argue that with that one question, the beginning of political science is born. I don't think that's a hyperbole. I think there's some legitimacy to that idea. What course of life is best? In other words, the point is this. We're not just reading these dialogues for entertainment, although I can tell you in advance, they are entertaining. There will be moments of great entertainment. I mean, if you're capable of enjoying academic entertainment. But there's more than just entertainment going on here. There is a point. That is to say, these dialogues are I'm going to use an academic word now, propedeutic. That is to say, didactic, inclining to teach. You're supposed to learn something. Okay, you're supposed to learn something. But because of the nature of the dialogue, it's sometimes difficult to know exactly what it is you're supposed to learn. Because at no given point does Plato just kind of step in as the writer of one of these dialogues and says, hey, now the most important thing you're supposed to be learning is blah, 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 blah. You're not going to see that at all. What you're rather going to see is almost like a little play where you're going to have this give and take back and forth. Let's use the academic term for that give and take. What do we call it? Does anybody know? What do we call that? Where a question is asked and then answered and then another question is... So it's often referred to as Socratic, but I'm looking for a second word. Sorry? No? I'm sorry? Dialogue is close, but we're going to call it dialectic. Dialectic. Okay, that's going to be the phrase that we'll use. So if we're engaged in dialectic, we are engaged in debate of sorts, back and forth. Now, for those of you who come out of the background of forensics and debate, even though you see it as somewhat of a contrivance now, you know, this kind of thing, the very idea of throwing a question out there, answering it, and then debating about the answers, that's what we mean by dialectic. Okay? So Socrates is going to be engaged in this process all his life. Plato is so impressed by the way that Socrates asks predominantly questions. The Socratic method is rooted in questions. Okay? So I'll ask a question, then I'll get an answer, then I'll come back with another question. Then I'll get an answer, then I'll come back with another question. And that's kind of the way that the Socratic dialogues work. Now, how can you learn from this experience? Well, you're going to read trying to listen. With that in mind, let's go to Republic 1 right away. Republic 1 will open with a framing story. Now, the story isn't going to be very long. By the way, let's point out, Republic 1, the first book, some German scholars think, actually, that it was a dialogue unto itself, maybe even postulating that the title of this dialogue was Thrasymachus from the very beginning. And it's kind of a standalone read. I mean, Republic 1 is a standalone read, which is why I'm giving you a couple of days of just concentrating on Republic 1. We're going to have an opening sequence, and we're going to hear all, you'll want this in your notes, all of the major themes of Republic are all going to get raised in Republic 1. All of them will. Okay? As we wade then into Republic, we are now going into the deep part of the ocean. There's no doubt about it. We've been playing in the shallows for 3 years. But now it's time for us to head into the deeper part of the ocean. But as we do so, we want to point out that there's going to be multiple ways to read this dialogue. And, of course, all the Platonist dialogues. We'll have only time to scratch the intellectual epidermis. Really, that's all we're really doing. We're just kind of looking at the very opening ideas, all right? But having said that, we can learn a lot about how to read a dialogue by just simply focusing on the opening lines of Republic 1. Let's go ahead and go to it now. I'm with you on page 139, and we'll be reading together. You should have a copy of Republic in front of you now, or at least looking on with a POW if you don't have your own. Notice the opening lines. And we're working again, I haven't said a lot about translation, we're working with the translator here of Rouse, who is one of the schoolboy translations that has been handed down to us. Very important translator. I think I mentioned Rouse when I was talking about translations of both the Iliad and the Odyssey as well. Book 1. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, Ariston's son, to pay my devoirs to the goddess, and at the same time I wanted to see how they would manage the festival, as this was the first time they held it. Let me just say this, and Platonist scholars are always pointing this out. Absolutely nothing is a throwaway or just a simple, thoughtless line in Republic. Nothing. So, for example, by book 6, book 7, we're going to know that up and down in this dialogue, really important. Socrates is going to be the narrator of the dialogue, and he says, I went down to the Piraeus. Now, the Piraeus, for those of you who have not been to Athens yet, we always have to say yet, the city itself is an interesting construction, physically. You have a very high hill. Up on that hill is built the most sacred of the temples that we call the Acropolis. Okay? That Parthenon. You've maybe seen pictures of that amazing structure. Down below that Acropolis hill, then, is the rest of the town of Athens. As you work towards the harbor area, that we call the Piraeus. This is the area that we would today reference as the mall. Okay? That is to say, where industry takes place and the like. When you are in the Platonist dialogues and you're going up, that is good. When you're going down, that's not so good. Okay, that's not so good. So notice right away we're told, I went down to the Piraeus. By the way, why did he go? You just read it. Why did he go? What was the point of going to the Piraeus? He's going to a religious festival. What's ironic about that? Jot that in your notes. What's ironic about a guy like Socrates going to church? On what grounds do they later condemn him in 399? On being an atheist, right? He's not very pious. And so he says, I needed to go to church, and so I went down to this festival down there for two reasons. One, I wanted to be entertained. Secondly, I wanted to see kind of how they did this thing, how they ran the show. Okay? We made our prayers, interesting for an atheist, right? We made our prayers and then saw the show and set off for the city. So in other words, he leaves Athens, and this is important for your notes, for just a brief spell he will leave the city of Athens. We will find out in Apology that Socrates does not like leaving the city of Athens. He is urbane through and through. He is a man of the city. Okay, but here he's left the city, but just, you can see the Piraeus, as I said, from the Acropolis, okay? And so he's walked down in there with who's he with?
Glaucon.
He's with Glaucon. For your notes, Glaucon is the brother of Plato, and Glaucon is one of the most important young interlocutors of our dialogue. You might put a note to yourself that Glaucon is kind of like the model student in many ways. He's kind of like the model student. Someone caught sight of us from a distance just as we had started for home. Okay? Polemachus, Cephalus' son, right? And he sent his boy, a slave, sometimes translated as slave, after us to tell us to wait for him. The boy caught me from behind by the cloak and said, Polemachus wants you to wait for him. So notice, Socrates, I went to church, I went to the festival, now I'm ready to go back to the city of Athens, and as I turn around to leave, somebody saw that I was there and sent his slave boy ahead, Polemachus, we'll find out who he is in a moment, and the slave grabs old man Socrates from the back, grabs a hold of his cloak, right? Now, what do I mean by this cloak thing? Well, if you scan and look at Miss Triple, for example, in the garment that she's wearing, this is normal Greek garment. So, for example, something will clasp around the throat. He's grabbed from the back to arrest his ability to go. Keep going. I turned around and asked where the master was. There he is, he said, coming behind. Do wait. Notice who responds. It's not Socrates, it's who? Glaucon says, oh yeah, we'll wait, right? In a little while, Polemachus came up, and Glaucon's brother, Adiamentus, and a number of others, right? For the show, it seemed. And Polemachus says, my dear Socrates, you seem to have just set out towards the city and to be going to leave us. Not a bad guess, I said. Well, said he, do you see how many we are? Oh, yes, Socrates says. Very well, then, he said, either stay here or fight for it. What? What does the young man Polemachus say to Socrates? You're not going anywhere. We need you to stay. We are telling you to stay. Do you see there are more of us than there are of you? Now again, there's nothing throwaway here. Absolutely nothing throwaway. Plato is going to be setting up one of the major themes of this dialogue. It is the theme of power. The theme of power. Later we will hear about this notion of numbers. In other words, is it the case that if there's a whole bunch of people saying something, that makes it more true than if there's only one person saying it because there are more people? Well, we're familiar with that idea. That oftentimes it's quite the opposite, right? Okay. There's more of us. In other words, we'll beat you up. Notice the irony of this. We'll beat you up, old man, if you don't stay. Okay. Socrates, kind of like, oh, okay. Keep reading. Surely there's a third choice, I said. If we can persuade you that you ought to let us go. The old man Socrates says, hey, instead of having a fight about this, can I take another option? Can I try to talk to you? Can we have a conversation where I can persuade you? And then you let us go. Makes sense, right? So in other words, notice two options basically here. One, we have a physical fight. Two, we have some kind of conversation. Of course, this will be the beginnings of early political theory in regards to conflict resolution, right? How do you resolve conflict? Do you resolve it through violence, physical, or do you resolve it through some kind of discussion? Here he says, let me try to persuade you. And now, to maybe some argue, the single most important line of all of Republic, surely this is a third choice. If you can, said he, could you persuade us if we refused to listen? Now that's an important line. And as young scholars of Platonism, we don't want to miss how important a line that is. What is it that Polemarchus says to him? He says, yeah, you might try and talk to me and to the rest of us, but what about if we refuse to listen to you? What's the point that's being made? What point is Plato making right away about how to read this dialogue? Anybody want to?
You won't learn anything if you don't actually listen to what he's saying.
Bingo. Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Outstanding. That's the point. If you are unwilling to listen, persuasion cannot happen. Think about how that relates at 3a. Think about how that relates to the text apology. How does that work with the text apology? Socrates stands up and gives a defense of his life. To what degree is it forceful? Does it work? Does it persuade his accuser? No. Why doesn't it persuade his accusers? They don't listen. They don't listen, right? This will become, of course, one of the central themes of many, many great teachers. You'll maybe even remember that Jesus Christ himself said this. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. That is to say, you've got to hear. Is there a difference between listening and hearing?
Yeah.
What is the difference?
Listening to comprehend what's being said.
You can actually hear the words coming out of someone's mouth, but not be listening to them. Now that's interesting. You can actually know someone is saying words to you and still not hear what's being said. This will be the invitation right away by Plato to say, if you really want to learn anything from your experience, you've got to listen. Think about how 12 years of education. 12. You're now finished. And how little amount of listening often was done. I'm not insulting. I'm challenging you to consider the potentiality that millions of words have come through your ears. But of all of that information, how little of it you ever really heard in 12 years. Now, let's point out, this is a text of education. You will be challenged right from the start. Here it is. You will be challenged to think about your education and the ways in which you've learned or not learned, the ways in which you've listened or not listened. Right? And at any given moment, I'm going to tell you in advance, this study for you can become very personal. It can. It can become deeply reflective. So for example, I know. Now I know something about the opening lines of Republic 1. Check that one off my little list. Is this going to be on the exam? And Plato could reach out of this dialogue and say, really? That's really how you're going to live your life. Is this going to be on the exam? At what point in your life will you ever start listening as opposed to just hearing? Maybe it's time. I've had students that say, you know what, I think you're right. For 4 years of high school, I did a lot of hearing, but not much listening. Maybe it's time. What if you really are going to graduate soon? And then it's all done. And what if you really do lie in bed on a June morning and ask the simple question, what did I ever actually learn in high school? How will you answer that question? Okay, I did what I had to do. But at some point the question becomes, really? That's your life? check off little boxes and call that living? At what point do you start listening? That's going to be the challenge. So as we began the dialogue, Plato's going to play a little game with you. He is absolutely right. You can't hear anything if you're not listening. And if you're not listening, you can't be persuaded. And if you can't be persuaded, you are a robot who simply does whatever it is you've been told to do. Now we're to the topic of freedom. And this will be one of the huge themes that we will reference right away in Republic. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to have the capacity to practice freedom? Not just freedom of physical movement, but rather freedom that we will consider intellectual freedom. Okay? So right away, we open now our dialogue with this observation. Note the irony. Hey, Socrates, we want you to stay so we can have a conversation, but we're not going to listen to you. It's as if they want to be able to say out loud, Socrates was in our house and we had this conversation, but they really don't want to necessarily hear anything Socrates has to say. It's more about, maybe we might say, the reputation of having Socrates in your house. Socrates, however, says, yeah, all right, let's go. They're going to go to Polemachus' dad's place. This is Cephalus. And we're going to meet Cephalus. And now I'm just working with your lecture notes. Cephalus is an old man. Now that's ironic because Socrates himself is old. But Cephalus is older than Socrates. And Socrates sees the old man. Now this is pure Socrates. Pure Socrates. He loves to ask questions. And so he sees the old man Cephalus. And he asks Cephalus, he says, Cephalus, tell me, what's it like to be old? Now note the irony of this. You got an old man asking an older man, what's it like to be old? To which Cephalus' response is an interesting one. He says, when I was young, I worried about getting old. But now that I'm here, he says, actually, it's not that bad as long as you got money. And Socrates says, what? Yeah, he says, yeah, it's not bad. He goes, the only way to get old is to have bank. If you got bank, you're okay. And Socrates is like, really? But why? And Cephalus says, well, here's the deal for me. He says, I'm a wealthy man. But the way I made my wealth was not so good. As a matter of fact, on my way up the corporate ladder, I had to jack a lot of people. Some of them really bad. Here's the great thing about being wealthy. 2 things. 1, you can go to all the people who you screwed. And you can walk up to them and you can say, hey, years ago, I jacked you pretty bad so that I could make some buck. And I've done it. Can I, pay you back now so we can even the score? And so Cephalus says, I like to have money because then I can go to all the people who I've hurt and maligned and said nasty things to, and I just walk up to them and say, hey, can I just pay you $1 million for running your business? And they go, yeah, sure, that'd be great. He goes, it's perfect. You get old and you got money, you can always, quote unquote, undo all the terrible things you did when you were young. Of course, notice the question that this raises. And it's an intriguing one. And as we go, I'll ask these questions of you, and then I'll have you kind of think about them on your own. One of the questions is it possible to become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and always behave morally correct? Or by definition, do you kind of have to be a bit of a shady schemer to be able to make money on Wall Street? Can you always tell the truth and make bank? Or inevitably, if you're going to engage in commerce, you have to become a little bit dirty. And that's just the way it is. Cephalus will say what? What would Cephalus' answer to that question be? Yeah, you got to screw people. Sorry, that's just the way it is. It's either me or it's you. On the way up the ladder, somebody's got to get bunged. And if it's not me, it's going to be you, right? But after the fact, if you've got money, you can always say, I'm sorry, and pay them back. Number 2, the cool thing about having money, dark irony here, is that while maybe people will forgive you for screwing them if you give them $1 million, there's always this thing about the gods. So Cephalus says having money allows you to go and pay off the gods as well. So that way when you die, you don't have to go to Hades and do something terrible like what happens to Sisyphus or Tantalus or some of those guys. You can go to Hades without fearing retribution from the gods if you have enough money to pay off the gods. Go to the sacrifices, donate lots of money to the church, that kind of thing. So having money allows for you to pay off both the people you screwed as well as the gods. Yes. To which Socrates has an interesting comment. He says, so you're saying having money allows you to do the right thing. We'll use the academic word for the first time now for your notes. The word is justice. Justice. Now we're going to define this word as doing the right thing. Okay? And now Socrates will turn to Cephalus and he'll say, so question, what does it mean to do the right thing? And how do you know what justice is? Cephalus goes, well, that's a very complicated question. I tell you what, I don't have time to have this conversation right now. You're going to see this a lot in the dialogues. There will be people who hear the question and then immediately are ready to bolt. They do not want to engage in the conversation. Why? They're too busy, right? Or they don't want to listen. And so Cephalus is this way. He's like, you know, your question is a great one, Socrates. I'm really impressed that you would ask a question like this, but here's the deal. I have to go to the festival and I have to pay off the gods some more. Because I was a really bad guy when I was young. So I've got to go to church, and I've got to make massive contributions to the church so that I can be sure that I'm forgiven of all my sins. I'm going to leave my son Polemachus in charge. And then he leaves. Now let's point out something really important in the movement in the dialogue. By the way, we're only just a few pages into the dialogue already. Major themes are already starting to be introduced. One of these important ones, though, is that Plato has got to get rid of the old school, if you will. The old man, Cephalus, is going to leave. He doesn't come back. We never hear from him again. Okay? And this is in some way Plato's attempt to try to say to you as a student, the questions we're going to ask, they need to be questions that are answerable, and old people usually have already got their minds made up. They already know everything. They don't need to have conversation. They know everything already. Leaving young Polemachus in charge. Right? So now you got a young man. And Polemachus kind of steps up in place of daddy. And he's like, well, okay, so the question, what was the question again? Almost like Polemachus wasn't really listening. And Socrates is going to say, the question is, how do you know when you're doing the right thing? And Polemachus basically is going to give some answers to this notion of justice. Okay? Now, I'm with you in your notes on page 2, okay, and I'm kind of following along, and we're into book 1, section 2. It's page 2 of your lecture notes, and as we go through this information, you're going to want to kind of flow these lecture notes. I'm kind of assuming, though, that you've already read Republic 1 and you kind of looked at these notes as well. So that way, this kind of allows me to go through this rather quickly, okay? The question now becomes for us, what does it mean to do the right thing? Or justice, as it's often referred to in Republic. And we're now going to get 3 definitions of what it means to do the right thing. All right? Giving everyone his due. Right? There is an interesting kind of counterexample for each one of these, by the way. Justice is, number 2, giving everyone what is appropriate for him. And then finally, 3, justice consists in being nice to nice people and mean to not so nice people. Let's go through each one of these real quickly. Polemachus says, look, it's really simple. Doing the right thing, or justice, is simply giving everybody, their due. Socrates has this really interesting example. He says, hey, but what about this? What about a situation where, for example, you loan a sword or a knife to somebody, and then they go nutsoid. Let's not say sword or knife, let's say a gun. A pistol. So somebody says, hey, would you hold on to my pistol for me? And then all of a sudden he shows up at the front door and he's just like raging mad at somebody. Give me that pistol back. I need it now. Question. Is it the right thing to give the pistol back to the guy? It belongs to him. But is it the right thing to give it to him in a moment of tremendous rage when, for example, he might shoot you or he might shoot somebody else? Kind of iffy. What about this thing about matter of giving everyone what's appropriate to him? Well, now Socrates raises a really interesting question. What about people who aren't nice to you? So if somebody, for example, says something mean about you, you have the right to jack them. Is that right or wrong? Socrates is going to make an interesting observation. He says, I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense. For example, what about the way we take care of ponies? Right? Ponies. Horses. The way we raise horses, for example. This will make some sense, I think, to 1 or 2 of you. If you have a pony that, for example, refuses to do what he's supposed to do you beat the horse? Are you mean to the horse? Or rather, are you inclined to say, you've got to be kind of gentle to an animal that's mean, to try to somehow correct him? This will be an insight of Socrates that he will amplify later. The notion of giving evil for evil, or an eye for an eye. What is it that MLK said along with Gandhi? An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. That is a deeply Socratic idea, okay? Finally, the notion of benefiting one's friend and doing harm to one's enemies, as we just said, this creates some serious problems. Socrates will say that if Polemachus is right, then it's the job of the just man to make unjust men even more unjust. And to that degree, Socrates says, that just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. By the way, notice at the end of section 2, we haven't found out yet what justice is. We're simply asking what it is not, right? We have to ask this question, though. What about punishment? What is the right way to punish? If someone, for example, does something that's inappropriate, how should you respond to that? This will become one of the real questions of jurisprudence, obviously. It's at this point now, in section 3 of Republic 1, that we are met with Thrasymachus. Now, who is Thrasymachus? Well, I like to call him the Darth Vader of this dialogue. Are you familiar with Darth Vader? That guy who has that funny sounding breath, and he's a not very nice guy. Thrasymachus has been listening. He is always pictured as being a wild animal. And he's been listening. And he says, this is ridiculous. Socrates, the old man, says, excuse me? Thrasymachus is like, I've been listening to this foolishness that you've been engaged in, this conversation about what it means to do the right thing. It's a very simple question, this thing about what it means to do the right thing. And Socrates starts to play that ironic game. Whoa, Thrasymachus, you know a lot more than me. Why don't you tell me what justice is? And Thrasymachus is like, well, I will if you pay me. Now, what's up with that? Thrasymachus is what we call a sophist. He teaches for a living. He makes bank from teaching. If you will, he's the first of those kinds of people we think of as lawyers that can argue either direction for money. Okay? Plato dislikes sophists. They see the whole enterprise of dialectic as nothing more than a game that they play, where they can make money. Well, after a series of back and forths, finally Thrasymachus will give his definition. Let's go ahead and point out that this we call the Thrasymachus position. And from now on in our conversations, we'll in fact reference it as the Thrasymachus position. What is the Thrasymachus position? Well, it's very simple, Thrasymachus says. Here it is. Somebody walks through the door there and says, you guys are all going to go do X. And Wilson goes, no, we're not. And the guy goes, shh, boom, and he blows away Wilson. And then he goes, you guys are all going to do X. And we all go, we're all going to do X. It's really simple. The Thrasymachus position is, the guy with the biggest gun makes the rules. It is that simple. Might makes right. Thrasymachus will point out, this is not difficult. This is not hard to understand. The people who have the power are the ones who decide what's right. How did they get that power? They had a bigger 12 gauge than everybody else. It ain't hard. Thrasymachus says, might makes right. This is not a difficult question at all. And he kind of does one of these things, like, there, done with that question. Socrates is like, well, yeah, but can I ask a question of you? Thrasymachus doesn't want to have any conversation. Sophists love to lecture. They hate dialogue. They don't want to do back and forth. They just want to give you the answer. For those of you who spend any time around people, come up with a topic. Politics is always fun this time of the year, isn't it? Come up with a topic and ask, and then watch them just go off.